Myth number 11, what was that? Basically, it's that the church has had a history, a terrible, rotten history of anti-Semitism. It goes something like this. For centuries, persecution of the Jews was justified in the name of God. The inspiration for the medieval ghettos and for the bloody pogroms and persecutions of history were provided by the doctrine that the Jews had murdered Christ and thereby provoked God's eternal wrath and punishment. And the Catholic Church has a particularly notorious record of anti-Semitism. That's the myth. Now, you have to understand as we start this out, there's no question that there were some Catholics, clergy included, through the many centuries who did believe that God hated the Jews, they were Christ killers, and some of them may even have gotten involved in outbursts of anti-Semitic violence. But as I'm going to unfold for you tonight, such views and such actions, they did not ever have official standing in the church and did not reflect the normal behavior of Catholic clergy toward the Jewish people. To the contrary, the clergy, from the Pope all the way down to priest, often defended the local Jews in their area from attacks, sometimes risking their own lives by doing so. So let's kind of dig into this. Let's start at the beginning. Many contemporary scholars today charge that the Catholic Church originated anti-Semitism. I'll give you a couple examples. The celebrated feminist theologian, I've mentioned her in a few of my myths, Rosemary Ruther. She has claimed that the church, I quote, must bear a substantial responsibility for the tragic history of the Jews in Christendom, which was the foundation upon which political anti-Semitism and the Nazi use of it was erected. Jules Isaac, he struck the same chord. Without centuries of Christian catechism, propaganda, and vituperation, the Hitlerian teachings, propaganda, and vituperation would not have been possible. And according to Robert T. Osborne, Christians have been anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic apparently from the beginning. Now, where do these charges come from? Well, the charges are based on passages in the New Testament that attack the Jewish people for rejecting Christ and also for persecuting Christians. But it's kind of amazing that although all of the scholars who believe that the Christians invented anti-Semitism, they know that there was a deep hostility towards Jews existing long before the birth of Jesus Christ himself. Now, perhaps this antagonism towards the church comes because these scholars have dismissed what ancients sometimes felt towards Jewish people and sometimes did to the Jewish people. They kind of just dismissed it as a bit of antipathy. It didn't really amount to anything lasting or basic, what we would call the true anti-Semitism, but was only a momentary thing, kind of arising entirely from political conflicts like the famous Maccabean revolt in Israel, where the Maccabees revolted against Antiochus IV of Syria. In fact, they would go on to say these negative feelings to the Jews were only sporadic, mere isolated pockets of distemper. That's how they describe it. In contrast, they say that real anti-Semitism was deep and abiding, something entirely new and introduced by Christianity, born of Christian arrogance and ambition. Well, if that were so, brothers and sisters, then many leading ancient Roman intellectuals must have been secret Christians. Here's what just a few of those famous Romans felt and said about the Jewish people. It was the great Roman philosopher and statesman Lucius Annaeus Seneca, lived from 4 BC to 65 AD, who denounced Jews as an accursed race and condemned their influence. It was Marcus Tullius Cicero, regarded as the greatest Roman orator, who complained that the Jewish rites and observances were at variance with the glory of our empire and the dignity of our name. It was the esteemed Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus, lived from 56 to 117 AD, who railed against the Jews because they despised the gods And he called their religious practices sinister and revolting. And not only that, according to Tacitus, the Jews had entrenched themselves by their very wickedness, and they sought increasing wealth through their stubborn loyalty to one another. He finishes by saying, but the rest of the world they confront with hatred reserved for the enemies. Well, can you explain to me how those comments written well before Christianity ever came into existence or into power, how do those comments differ from what we consider standard modern anti-Semitism that's usually defined and measured? And by the way, it just wasn't words. It was also very grievous actions. For example, the Jews were expelled from Rome in 139 BC by an edict that charged them with attempting to introduce their own rights to the Romans and thereby infecting Roman morals. Then in 19 AD, Emperor Tiberius ordered the Jews in Rome to burn all their religious vestments and assigned all Jewish males of military age to serve in the army in Sardinia to fight against the brigands. Whereas a Roman historian Tacitus said, if they succumbed to the pestilential climate, well, it was a cheap loss. In addition, all of the Jews were banished not only from Rome, but actually from all Italy on pain of slavery for life if they did not obey. And this was recorded by Paulinius Suetonius, another historian. In 70 AD, Emperor Vespasian imposed a special tax on all the Jewish people in the empire, thereby impounding the contributions they normally made to the great Jewish temple. He took all that money into his coffers. And then in 95 AD, Emperor Domitian executed his cousin Flavius Clemens and many others for having drifted into Jewish ways, as the historian Cassio Dio put it. So, the Romans, as ancient as they were, did not invent anti-Semitism. It was part of their life, but it wasn't theirs alone. There are several surviving ancient manuscripts, records of versions of an account of an expulsion of lepers and many undesirable foreigners from Egypt, much like the great Exodus story that we hear in the book of Exodus of our Bible. These accounts have been interpreted by some scholars as the first appearance in history of anti-Semitism. But we do know for certain that there were many hostile treatments of the Jews as godless misanthropes written in the 1st century BC by Greeks, including Diodorus Siculus, Strabo, and Apian. And it was Apian who accused the Jewish people of ritual cannibalism. So clearly, anti-Semitism did not arise from the conflict of Christians and Jews over the question of whether Jesus was God or not, even though that was a conflict, certainly. Rather, what it stemmed from was the intense commitment that exclusive religious people generated among their advocates and their adherents, that kind of they would isolate themselves into small little groups, isolate and not integrate. It's kind of the problems in what we face here in the United States. People become in these pockets. They're especially bad over in Europe right now. Whole cities are all divided into different nationalities, and there's no intermingling between them. And that isolation provoked a lot of irritation, anger, fear, distrust. As the distinguished E. Mary Smallwood put it, Jewish exclusiveness bred unpopularity, which in turn bred anti-Semitism, just as Christian exclusiveness subsequently bred Roman antagonism toward them too. In fact, not only were Jews and Christians persecuted by Rome, but so were exclusive pagan faiths, including congregations devoted to the goddess Isis and to Cybele, called Magna Mater. What happened, though, in time with the demise of those pagan faiths and the rise of Christianity became the majority people in the Roman Empire, it was anti-Semitism that was the only one of these ancient prejudices to continue on in history. But unless you believe that the Catholic Church was the only channel of cultural transmission, then there's no reason to suppose this legacy of pre-Christian anti-Semitism didn't live on. In other words, it was not just part of maybe a fight between the church and the Jews, and there was those fights, but it was something part of the whole culture, and it pervaded and went on through history. Now, as often as I said, linked to the fact that this exclusivity of the Jews who didn't interact. Now, they didn't interact because they believed the world was unclean, and they were called by God the chosen people, so they were unto themselves, but that again provoked antagonism from other people. So in the ancient world, antagonism toward the Jews was rooted in this distrust, frustration, and fear of this exclusivity by the Jews, and it continued on into the world, into civilization, eventually which became Christian. And I say that because, the New Testament never portrays the Jews as kind of ambitious, wealthy misers, kind of on the line of Shakespeare's play, of the Merchant of Venice, Shylock. That was kind of the epitome. That was never a version from the New Testament or the Old Testament through the church at all. That was a cultural thing that went through history. Now, it was picked up later on in the medieval times, but it was not a result of a religious difference or fight. It was a result of a cultural reality because these people had this sense of exclusivity. Of course, now, as I mentioned, anti-Semitism is certainly rooted in theological differences between the Jewish and Christian faith. There are a number of seemingly harsh and fearful and hostile references to the Jews scattered throughout the New Testament. Let me give you a few examples. One is the most incendiary one and most frequently cited. It's the passage of Matthew 27, 24 to 26. When Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourself." Then the people as a whole answered, "His blood be on us and our children." So he released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. That became, up the road, sometimes a rallying point for people. They're the Christ killers. Now, I find it amazing, though, if you really understand that passage, unbelievably prophetic, and I don't think you've ever heard this before, but those people calling for Jesus' blood, that his blood be upon us, really was a call for the grace of salvation. Because how are we saved? We are literally baptized and covered with the blood of Jesus Christ. And almost unwittingly, they may be out of anger and rejection of the Christ, we're calling not a blood curse, as sometimes people interpret it. I call it a blood blessing of salvation on themselves. But unfortunately, that was one of the passages that was used often. Matthew 23:37, when Jesus looked at Jerusalem shortly before he marched into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it." John 5:16 to 18. Therefore the Jews started persecuting Jesus because he was doing such things, namely carrying a sick man on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is still working, and I am still working." For this reason, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but was also calling God his own Father. Now, on the surface, when you hear these passages, well, they've caused many a modern Christian a great deal of anguish. Oh my gosh, it's so harsh. Ay, 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 ay. And it's provoked a lot of bitterness on the part of the Jews. Unfortunately, in condemning these and similar New Testament passages, Christian apologists and Jewish critics far too often interpret these passages out of context and in non-comparative ways. Let me explain that. As for context, you got to remember that these lines were written by men who still consider themselves as Jews. Maybe a bit more enlightened one or more fulfilled one, as we say, that we as Christians are fulfilled Jews. And they were addressed to the Jewish people who had failed to recognize God's plan, refused to believe in it, recognize the whole revelation that was before them. So harsh Christian critics such as J.T. Sanders should not focus entirely just on the New Testament words, but should compare its statements about the Jews with the Old Testament words and polemics against other Jews who failed to meet a particular prophet's standards of proper faith. If you go to the Old Testament, what do we see there? For someone like Jeremiah 18:23, he asked the Lord, do not forgive their iniquities. Now, who is he speaking to? His own Jewish people. Do not blot out their sins from your sight. Let them be tripped up before you. Deal with them while you are angry. Then, warming to his theme, Jeremiah quoted the Lord's response. And in this place, I will make void the plans of Judah and Jerusalem. I will make them fall by the sword before their enemies and by the hand of those who seek their life. I will give their dead bodies for food to the birds of the air and the wild animals of the earth. And I'll make them eat the flesh of their sons and the flesh of their daughters. That's pretty harsh, Pretty anti-Semitic. But what is it? It's written as from a Jew to a Jew, as a prophet would. And that's the context of these things. These people were still of the Jewish, or we would call them Jewish Christian, but very much of the Jewish faith, criticizing prophetically that you closed your heart to everything that you hoped for. Also, in similar fashion, much anguish about these statements have arisen because they are anachronistically taken to be statements of what? A nasty, abusive Christian majority. Okay. But no account is taken of the fact that when these passages were written, Christians and Christianity was only a tiny, tiny little segment of the ancient world. It was a tiny persecuted minority, not only among the huge, huge Greco-Roman Empire, but even amid the large populations of Jews in Palestine and those making up many, many of the ancient Greco-Roman cities where Jews had been basically during the diaspora, which means when they were put in exile the 2 or 3 times that they were in history, the Assyrians, Babylonians, they were spread all over the empire and they settled into these ancient cities and they started their exclusivity, which again resulted in a lot of antagonism to them because they were unto themselves. But there were all these cities. And it was to them that the Christians were going to evangelize, and the Jewish people who were literally the majority in those things, at least religiously, it provoked a lot of antagonism. As late as the year 100 AD, by which the time all the Gospels were written, some of the other books of the New Testament, there were probably slightly fewer than only 8,000 Christians on earth. And even a century later, there was only about 200,000 Christians. In contrast, there were about 7 million Jews, only 1 million of them living in Palestine or Israel. So in the early days, it was not the Romans that were persecuting ongoing the Christians, but it was the Jewish population in the beginning that was persecuting the Christians because they considered them a serious source of danger to their own religion. The evidence of Jewish persecution of Christians is scattered, and obviously it's not very accurate because there's not a whole lot of basic documents that we can find that justify this thing. For one thing, for the Jews, but we do know that for the Jews, that Christianity was an aberration of their faith. It was a heresy for them, as we would consider certain other things heresies. It was a heresy because they considered it an abomination. Unlike the pagans who didn't accept Jewish faith, these people were their own, and they've turned their back on it according to them. And they declared themselves the rightful heirs of the real Jewish tradition. And worse yet, they were proclaiming and teaching an outrageous heresy, that Jesus was the Son of God. Therefore, they felt monotheism was kind of abandoned. So it was blasphemy in their eyes. As for evidence of actual Jewish attempts to punish these crimes, well, we can find them in historical documents like the New Testament. In Acts 22, 4 and 5, St. Paul confessed that prior to his conversion in about the year 35 AD, he delivered Christians to the high priest and councils of elders for punishment. Other parts of the Acts record that the apostles were flogged and punished for preaching the gospel. The deacon Stephen was stoned to death by order of the Sanhedrin in the year 37 AD. Then after Paul had shifted his mission efforts to the west, he received a number of beatings and unsuccessful stonings by whom? Local Jewish leaders in various cities. And then according to the great historian, the Jewish historian Josephus, he lived from 37 to 101 AD, and confirmed later on by the Christian historian Eusebius, who lived from 263 to 339, James, the brother of the head of the church in Rome, that they call the brother of Jesus, the head of the Church of Jerusalem, he was publicly mocked and executed by Jewish leaders in Jerusalem about the year 61 AD. So the Jewish threat resulting from the conflict of religious teaching was very real and dangerous to Christians. Consequently, a number of scholars have pointed out that anti-Jewish passages found in the New Testament should be interpreted again in context and not anachronistically, because the Christians, when those things were written, were just a small, tiny minority. They weren't the ruling majority. So really, it wasn't the Christians causing problems, it was the Jewish and Romans causing problems for them. But the fact of the matter is, these passages that a lot of people find offensive, both Christian and Jews, they're only one side of a very tense, angry religious conflict. What has been missing for a long time was firm evidence about the other side. What do I mean by the other side? Well, they say it was all the Christian side. There's no records at all about any Jew saying anything harmful about the Christian faith at all. There's no records in the Talmud, which were those collection of writings by the ancient rabbis that began in the first century. Some of these contemptuous anti-Christian comments were, now so we know that some of these comments were made up. In other words, someone made some fake news and they said it came from the Jewish people. One example was that this Spanish Dominican friar in the 13th century said he had been leaked to him from Jewish people who became converts, leaked to them this information about the Talmud. These were later quoted by Martin Luther that led to a huge persecution of Jews by the Lutherans. A similar 2-volume work was published in Germany in the 1700s. Again, these were fake news. Now, both of these publications attracted attention from anti-Semites who would use them to cite them in very angry pamphlets. But their authenticity was both condemned by the church and by Jewish leaders, saying this is not real stuff. So it was long held among a lot of scholars that there were no authentic references to Jewish people saying negative things about the Christian church. That was until Peter Schaeffer came along. Who's Peter Schaeffer? He's the director of Judaic Studies at Princeton University, and he has absolutely impeccable credentials. And he worked for a long time with both what we call the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds, collection of rabbinic writings from the first century. The Jerusalem Talmud was written probably in the 1st and 2nd century. The latter one, the Babylonian, was probably in the 3rd to the 6th centuries. But scattered through these enormous compendium of rabbinical writings, there are in fact many, many negative remarks about Jesus Christ. And Schaeffer, let me quote him. There are counter-narratives that parody the New Testament story, most notably the story of Jesus' birth and death. They ridicule Jesus' birth from a virgin. Most remarkably, they counter the New Testament passion story with its message of Jewish guilt and shame as Christ killers. Instead, they reverse it completely. Yes, they maintain we accept responsibility for killing Christ, but there's no reason to feel ashamed because we rightfully executed a blasphemer and an idolater. Accordingly, they subvert the Christian idea of Jesus' resurrection by having him punished forever in hell and making clear that this fate awaits all his followers as well if they keep following this impostor. He cites very specific things, and I'll quote them. Although Mary was married to Joseph, Mary conceived through an adulterous interlude with a Roman soldier named Pandera, a name probably derived from the Greek word parthenos, which means virgin, and gave birth to Jesus. He was a bastard child. And according to Jewish law, both should have been stoned to death. Mary for committing adultery, Jesus for being a bastard. Jesus was a mamzer, or another word, a Hebrew word for bastard, and would therefore have been excluded from all participation in religious life and interpretation of some of the law. Mamzers were to be stoned. Jesus engaged in sexual promiscuity with Mary Magdalene, among other people. Jesus was convicted of sorcery, so said the Talmud. Jesus was not crucified, but instead was stoned by the Jews, who then hung his body on a tree. And Jesus is spending eternity in hell, boiling in excrement. So there we have it, huh? There's a religious conflict. There is passages in the New Testament reflect this antagonism of the Christians towards the Jews because of their refusal to believe in Jesus. They felt it was a hard-heartedness. They felt they were taking the role of the prophet. And it's balanced by, or contrasted by, the Talmudic antagonism towards Christians. And remember, keep in mind, all this was taking place when the Christians were still a minority, not a majority. Of course, now, when the Christians eventually became the majority, starting about the 4th century, with Constantine becoming emperor and then the tremendous explosion in the Christian church, attitudes towards the Jews became of far greater social significance than whatever any anti-Christian attitude that the Jews had towards the Christians. And I'm not saying this excuses one or the other. It's just to see the context of it all. But misleading or misled historians to the contrary, one thing is for certain: the church never translated the antagonisms of the Old Testament, of the New Testament, those incendiary kind of passages. They never translated it into a warrant to be able to go and attack Jewish people. Never. To examine, you see, this topic of church attacks on the Jewish people thoroughly, it would be very important for us to examine the data available on every fatal anti-Semitic attack by groups of Western European Christians from the year 500 to the year 1600 AD. Why I say those years? Well, we don't have any clear records at all before 500 AD, but after that, we got some very, very good records, huh? And examining all the reliable documents that we can find, there appears to have been only one event between the entire 1100 years, 500 to 1600, or 500 to 1,000 years, okay? And what happened with that one event? A mob killed several Jews at Clermont in southern France in the year 554 AD, and they forced a number of Jewish people to become Christian. Now, the fact that there was no other incident in about a period of literally 500 years, what did it point to? That the church roundly condemned that action, stressing also that forced conversions were invalid and that the Jewish people should be left alone, a position, by the way, that was asserted again and again and again and again by the church through the centuries. The prohibition, by the way, on baptizing or forced baptism also extended to whom? The Muslim people. Now, this reality had been confirmed by a distinguished Jewish historian, or many of them. The Israeli historian Nachum Gidal referred to this event as the halcyon days of the Christian-Jewish relationship. Okay, this is the 500-year period. The prize-winning scholar of Jewish history, Robert Chazan, described the period as tranquil. Leon Poliakov, one of the most respected contemporary historians of anti-Semitism, wrote of the favorable status of Jews during this era. Kings and nobles and bishops granted Jews a broad autonomy. Thus they administered their own communities and lived according to their own laws. Talmudic scholarship flowered again on the banks of the Rhine and the Seine at the very period when it was falling into decay in places like Babylon. The Jews continued to mix freely with the Christian populations and to live on excellent terms with them until the 11th century. No chronicles mention outbursts of popular hatred of the Jews. So for more than 5 centuries, hostile, that other people now today use, these hostile, supposedly New Testament passages against the Jews had no violent consequences. A number of medieval historians Also pointed out that during the same era, the church took no action or interest in even heresies. Not that there weren't heretics at that time. The church chose to ignore them. Now, why is that? Why is that? Well, in my judgment, these two phenomena are linked together. The tolerant policies toward both Jews and heretics were a function of the fact that neither posed an institutional threat to the church. Let me state it another way. Where a relatively secure religious monopoly exists, a substantial amount of religious nonconformity will be tolerated to the extent that the dissenters are perceived as posing no threat to the power of the religious elite. In other words, the Catholic Church felt utterly secure because it was so much the majority. And because of that, it let people be. Even pagans, as I said last week, they let them be, figuring in time, by their example, they could convert them by example in the preaching of the gospel. But they let them be. And there was a great period of tranquility. Now, this period of toleration, it ended in the 11th century. And why was that? If you remember your history, what's happening in other parts of the world right now? Islam is not only on the rise, but it's on the expansion. It's moving and it's conquering a lot of things. Remember, when there's relatively tranquility, things are okay and you tolerate people that are different than you. But with the conflict of Islam, it changed the perception of religious differences. Major religious conflicts will generate a climate of religious intolerance, causing toleration to be withdrawn or withheld even from non-threatening but non-conforming other religious groups. Now again, this is not the official policy of the church. It's something that happens. Even in this environment now where we are threatened by the invasion of terrorists, everybody's kind of on edge. And so now immigration has come to the front. And and quite understandably, everybody's on edge because we see what's happening around the world in Europe. When you get things that are uneasy, there's conflict in the world, it causes an uneasiness everywhere. And that was what was happening. But it wasn't the policy of the church. Conflicts often just came out of this climate of distrust, fear of nonconformists. And it prompted whom? Laity to act on behalf of these perceived religious threats. And this explains the 11th century explosion of fatal anti-Semitic outbursts in parts of Christianity, as well as initiation of a bloody campaign, the same way, against whom? The heretics. Remember, the heretics were kind of contained? Now both become targets. By the way, a serious conflict with Christianity broke out as these conflicts happen within Christianity. Interesting enough, over in Islam, the same phenomenon was happening. They began to witch hunt and to persecute the Jews and other Christians, anybody that was different than them. So it's not just a phenomenon that's connected to Western civilization or Christianity. It's just a phenomenon of civilization. A sad one, but a real one, Some Catholic clergy, initiated the violent repression of heresies that began in the 11th century, many of which escalated to bloody campaigns. Last week I spoke about the Cathars or Albigensian. It was a terrible, terrible heresy in the church. You've got to remember that these heresies were more than just false teachings. That's not what upset the equilibrium. Many of them had political implications. These heresies said, we got the information, we got the right, you don't trust anybody else, you don't throw your allegiance in with any king or anything. So it was really subversive. It was really undermining the authority of the politics of the day, the king and his kingdom, and it was dividing the unity of that kingdom. And that threat is what began to inspire the attacks for heresy, and then it began to bleed over into anti-Semitism. But the fact of the matter is the clergy, on a whole, with rare exception, did not initiate or lead the outbursts of anti-Semitism that began. They were led, unfortunately, by laymen, and it was the churchmen or the clergy who were the ones that stood up most for the Jewish people. Now, some historians believe that there were anti-Jewish attacks that began in the wake of the People's Crusade, which was part of the First Crusade. What was the People's Crusade? It was a wonderful, kind of odd character called Peter the Hermit. He was a charismatic fellow. And he started preaching a People's Crusade to go and take back the Holy Land. And he got thousands of people following him. Thousands. Men, women, children uprooted themselves and followed him along the way. And bishops were trying to discourage him going, but they just kept going, almost like lemmings. They kept following this person. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of people say, well, they were the ones that instigated anti-Semitism. The fact of the matter was, it wasn't that. Wherever they went, in order to eat, they looted whatever they found in front of them, whether it was Jewish or Christian. Both suffered through these people who were coming through and trying to survive as they got on. By the way, the People's Crusade was absolutely wiped out in 1096. They were massacred by the Muslims. And after that, there was no other Crusaders, if you want to say, attacks. It is well documented, though, this is true, that after 5 centuries of absolute tranquility in Jewish-Christian relationships, it all ended on May 3rd, 1096. What happened on that day? A minor Rhineland count. Now, the Rhine Valley would be on the west side of Germany, kind of from Bonn all the way down this way towards France. It's that area there. It's called the Rhine Valley. A minor Rhineland count named Emich of Lessingen, he led an attack against the Jewish population of Speyer or Spear. What was the context of that? Well, Count Emich of Lessingen had been left in charge by his own duke, his boss, who marched off with the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV. And Emich's job was to recruit reinforcements and to follow. Well, a couple things were happening this time. Just before Henry left, there was an ugly rumor spreading around that Henry intended to kill all the Jews because they were Christ killers. You know, these kinds of awful things develop with people. You know, here in the country, we had a blight of Ku Klux Klan. This kind of stuff that stirs and stirs, or the white supremacist, you know. And it's not just with Caucasians, it's on other people too as well. But this rumor went around, and Henry heard it, and he wrote a very scorching letter condemning it, saying it wasn't true, and he wanted it publicized throughout his kingdom. And then he took off for the crusade. Well, Emich either didn't get it or didn't want to believe it. In fact, he said, why should I go to fight the Christ killers over there in Israel when I got them right here? So that's what spurred his attack. What we do know is that Emich believed that there was no sense in going to Israel when I got them right here. I'll just kill the enemy here. So he led his men to Spear. Now the bishop of Spear, he took all the local Jews into his estate and locked the gates. And he kept Emich out. The only Jews that were killed in that encounter, or that episode, were 12 Jews who didn't heed the bishop to come here, let me protect you. Emich then led his forces to Worms. Remember, that's the famous place where the Edict of Worms, where Martin Luther would attack his 95 Theses. And again, Emich went there to destroy the Jews. Again, the bishop stood up, tried to get all the people in. He got them into his estate, closed the doors. But this time, Emich wouldn't be denied, and he broke down the doors, and he beat the bishop, and he killed a lot of the Jewish people, about 500. The same pattern was continued the next week in Mainz. Again, the bishop tried to shield the Jews. Again, Emich attacked with his soldiers, and they beat him to a pulp, almost killing him, and they killed the Jews. The same action would happen then, led by Emich, to Cologne and then in Metz. As Leon Poliakov summed it up, it's important to note that almost everywhere the bishops attempted, even at the peril of their own lives, to protect the Jews. Now, at that point, what happened after Metz, a portion of Emmech's forces broke away and set out to purge the Moselle Valley of Jews. What were they doing now? They were spreading out, and they were attacking towns that didn't have a bishop or a powerful, wholesome leader that could control the situation. And that's where they started. They went one after the other. And then they killed several thousand Jews. Meanwhile, some of Emmech's leaders, some of his generals, broke off. A guy named Gottschalk and Volknar, they went off and they attacked both Prague and Regensburg. Now, meanwhile, when the Pope got word of this, he harshly condemned everything, roundly condemned it, but there was nothing he could do. What stopped it only was the fact that these people, Volknar, Gottschalk, and eventually Emmech, went into Hungary to continue their marauding and their killing, and the Knights of Hungary stood behind their bishop and they wiped them out one at a time. They destroyed Gottschalk's forces, then the Volknar's forces, and then finally Emmech. And the fact of the matter is, according to the revered historian of the Crusades, Sir Stephen Runciman, he lived from 1903 to 2000, these defeats struck most good Christians as punishments meted out from on high, from God, to the murderers of the Jews. This was consistent with the efforts of local bishops to preserve the Jews, and the fact that the other armies gathered for the First Crusade, they didn't go after the Jewish people. They went for the purpose of defending the Holy Land. They didn't go to advance their cause to get money. In fact, the great noble families of Europe bankrupt themselves, and a lot of them died there trying to free the Holy Land. And only the First Crusade was really successful. But their whole purpose was to defend the Jewish people. The only Jewish people that died in any of those crusades were those that stayed in Jerusalem when the Muslim forces had Jerusalem, and the Crusaders begged them to give up, and they wouldn't surrender. In fact, they did very sacrilegious things, and the Crusaders, they said, had just been marching around and out there, and they're out of water. And finally, they breached the walls, and then it became a hand-to-hand fight. And unfortunately, the Muslims, because they offered them free leaving if they would just leave Jerusalem, they didn't. And the Jewish people inside there were killed. But they weren't killed for their faith. They were killed because they had collaborated with the Muslims who were fighting against the Christians. Unfortunately, while the attacks from the Rhineland Jews were the work of a few people, what did they do? They set a pattern by directing attention to the issue of continuing to permit Jews to be different than the society, and that differences is going to cause a disruption in the unity of our society. They continue to reject Jesus. They're nonconformist. Now it's creating fear in the lives of the community. And even a few churchmen succumbed to this temptation. By the time of the Second Crusade, Abbé Pierre, who was an abbot of the French monastery of Cluny, he pointed out this: what good is the good of going to the end of the world at a great loss of men and money to fight Saracens when we permit among us other infidels who are 1,000 times more guilty towards Christ than are the Mohammedans? Interesting, even though that was an attitude in France, the outbreak of violence didn't happen ever in France, at least in those times. It happened in the Rhine Valley. The massacres of Jews took place during the Second Crusade. Again, not the Crusaders. A lot of people want to attach the murder of Jews to the Crusaders. It wasn't the Crusaders, it was the people that stayed that got instigated by certain people. And in this case, they went on destroying, killing Jews in Cologne, Mainz, Metz, Worms, and Speyer. And it was propagated or inspired by a monk named Rudolf, who helped stir up these anti-Semitic outbursts. And by the way, the death toll would have been much higher if it hadn't been for St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who rode on a horse from all the way from Clairvaux all the way out, and he stopped the violence. He was a great saint and so admired, so brilliant. And this intervention was reported by Ephraim Abban, a Jewish chronicler, and he said this: "Then the Lord heard our sigh. He sent after the evil priest a decent priest, a good man. His name was Abbot Bernard from the city of Clairvaux, who said to them, 'It is fitting that you go forth against Muslims. However, anyone who attacks a Jew and tries to kill him as if though he attacks Jesus himself, to kill him is as though he attacks Jesus himself. My pupil Randolph, who advised destroying them, did not advise properly. For in the book of Psalms it is written concerning the Jews, kill them not, lest my people forget. Everyone esteemed this priest as one of their saints, and were it not for the mercies of our Creator who sent this abbot, there would have not been a remnant or survivor among the Jews. When the Crusades petered out, sadly, this strain of violence against the Jews continued in one place in Europe, in the Rhineland. I find it kind of amazing that again, came all the way to World War II, and we see this terrible pogrom against Jews in that area, starting there. Why again? It had penetrated the popular culture, and also because these areas lacked significant, strong leaders and didn't have a bishop there who could confront this and drive it back. So in 1270, local rabble-rousers who claimed to be descendants of Judenbräters, which are called Jew roasters, they killed all the Jews along the Rhine, attacking in 1283, 1285, 1286, and 1298. And then this kind of prevalent, again, use it comparatively to what the Ku Klux Klan did here to the black community. The kind of vitriol and the kind of prejudice that just gets stored up and it becomes like gospel truth. That's exactly what was going on. Again, the bishops were condemning it. Church was fighting it, but it was these independent people who would grow up. When the Black Death broke out in Europe, it once again was only in the Rhine Valley that church was unable to protect the Jews. And what was the charge? The charge was the Jews brought the plague by poisoning the Christian wells. That was the charge, huh? Well, brothers and sisters, that story began in Spain, and it was initially claimed about the Muslims, that they had poisoned the wells there. And then the story changed, and the Spanish Jews were accused of spreading that plague, so that, you see, that's where this anti-Semitism came. But wherever they could, wherever there was a bishop, they stopped it cold. They stopped it cold because why? The Pope, Clement IV, he wrote a papal bull. He directed the clergy to protect the Jews, denounce all claims about poisoned wells, and ordered all those who spread the rumor, as anyone who harmed a Jew would be permanently excommunicated. But sadly, that happened in a lot of places in Europe, but not in the Rhineland. Another wave then came of this anti-Semitism and the Jewish massacres. Where? Right in the Rhine Valley. Speyer, Mainz, Metz, Worms, and Cologne. Why did rabid anti-Semitism persist only here and not in the German areas or other areas of Europe? Again, the local authorities were powerful in the other areas, and they could stop it, as well as the bishops. It's only in those areas, kind of rural areas, that didn't have any political or church control. As to why lethal attacks on local Jews ceased in the Rhineland area early in the 15th century, why was that? Well, brothers and sisters, there were no more Jews anywhere. First, there was a massive migration of Jews from the Rhine Valley to Eastern Europe. At the same time, many of the notorious anti-Semitic communities had already evicted all the Jews. Cologne, Germany did it in 1424, and most of the rest of the other those culpable cities did it soon after. No Jews were allowed to reside in those areas when, gets this, from the 15th century or even the 13th century all the way to the 19th century. But again, the eviction of Jews from the Rhineland, it was not the doing of the church. And it's evident by the fact that many of these large Jewish communities, they scattered across the rest of Germany where the church was strong and protective. Also keep in mind that when Jews were expelled elsewhere, as like from England in 1290, France in 306, and Spain in 1492, this was done not by the church, but by secular authorities. It's amazing how the secular political realm will do these things, and then they go back and blame the church, huh? They were the ones doing all the harm, political things, not the church. Now, again, there were some church people who did some bad things, and these people were nominal Catholics or Christians, but they certainly were not part of the church, and they were not obeying the Pope. Even when the church stood as a barrier to these attacks from the Jews of Europe, we know that some Catholics did collaborate in forms of discrimination against them. Didn't kill them, but they discriminated against them. For example, in most places, the construction of synagogues required permission. There were disputes as to when Passover could be celebrated. Conversion from Christianity to Judaism was strictly forbidden. Many prohibitions were placed on social contracts between Christians and Jews. Intermarriage was illegal, and so were sexual relations, and Jews could not have Christian servants. Do you remember Shakespeare play, The Merchant of Venice? The Italian fellow, the Christian owed 10,000 ducats. And remember how it was resolved? Does anybody remember the story? Or 1 pound of flesh or 10,000 ducats was the line. Well, how did it turn out? The kid didn't have 10,000 ducats, so the court ruled you could take a pound of flesh, but the law says you cannot spill 1 drop of Christian blood. So they put him into an impossible position, huh? That was a kind of a reflection of the persecution done not in a physical way, but in social ways. Eventually, in most parts of Europe, Jews were required to wear a badge or some kind of identifying mark. Didn't that come to pass later on in the Jewish when we had the yellow star? Huh? Often, Jews were required to live in a special part of the town, which became known as ghetto. And a ghetto is a corruption of the Italian word borghetto, or little borough. Huh? Now, that's what's been happening in the Christian world. A lot of times you're going to find is historians will come along and say, look at this terrible thing that the Christian Europe did to these poor Jews. And the Muslims, oh my gosh, the Muslims were so tolerant. They were so tolerant. Well, first of all, they don't compare apples and apples. They're comparing apples and bananas because it depends on what time you're talking about. You're talking about the same period, maybe not so, but other periods, there was great intolerance by Muslims of the Jewish people and Christians. But for centuries and generations, historians identified the situation of the Jews under Muslim Spain, for example, as the golden age, in contrast to that terrible anti-Semitism happening over in Christendom. That was the going way. That's why people never disagreed with Stanley Lane Poole, who in 1897, he claimed the history of Spain offers us a melancholy contrast. For nearly 8 centuries under her Mohammedan rulers, Spain set all Europe a shining example of a civilized and enlightened state. Whatever makes a kingdom great and prosperous, whatsoever tends to refinement and civilization, was found in Muslim Spain. Then he goes on to contrast this shining example with the cruel and fanatical Spain that expelled the Jews following the defeat of the Moors by Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492. Again, that was the going outlook and writings of many, many historians. No one challenged, for example, the celebrated Jewish historian Heinrich Hirsch Gratz. He asserted that Judaism ever strove towards the light whilst monastic Christianity remained in darkness. Well, I covered that in the whole story of Middle Ages, where it's just one long, dark period with nothing going on. Thus, in the 10th century, there was only one country that offered suitable soil for the development of Judaism where it could blossom and flourish, and it was Mohammedan Spain. And most intellectuals nodded in agreement when Albert Einstein's son-in-law, Rudolf Kayer, exalted it is like a historical miracle. And in the very era of history in which orgy of persecution against Jews occurred in Christian Europe, the Jews of Moorish Spain enjoyed a golden age, the like of which he had not known since the days of the Bible. Anthony Burgess wrote that after the fall of Granada, the magnificent emirate of Cordoba, where beauty, tolerance, learning, and order were only fantastic memory. You know, and they point to by the way, that as a volume commemorating the 500th anniversary of the expulsion of the Jews from Christian Spain, it was noted this: golden age of Spanish Jewry was personified above all by Maimonides. Well, brothers and sisters, it's difficult to know how anyone, even the most bitter anti-Catholic people, a lot of this myth comes from anti-Catholicism, could have possibly believed that. Because you ever take the time to read the biography of Moses Maimonides, it makes a travesty of all these claims. Who was Maimonides? He was one of the most brilliant scholars of the time. In 1148, Maimonides' family pretended to convert to Islam when the Jews of Cordoba were told to become Muslim or leave on pain of death. Note that when most historians mention that in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella ordered all the Jews of Spain to convert to Christianity or leave, they forgot to mention that the Muslims had imposed the same demand in the 12th century. See, they pick and choose what they want, but you see the wholeness, the whole part of history, you see it's different. Nor do they mention that many Jews who opted to leave Moorish Spain, rather than pretend to convert, they settled in Christian areas in northern Spain. Okay. In any event, after 11 years of posing as converts, the Maimonides family became so fearful of discovery that they fled to Morocco, where they continued their deception. Thus, throughout his adult life, the most celebrated medieval Jewish thinker posed as a Muslim. His story clearly reveals, as Richard Fletcher has put it so well, Moorish Spain was not a tolerant and enlightened society, even in its most cultivated epoch. In fact, just as Jews lived as suppressed minority in Christendom, even during the tranquil period, both Jews and Christians were, under the Muslim rule, put under severe restrictions and living a prejudice against them by the Muslim society. What happened in the Christian, and I find it fascinating that this thing parallels Esau. I think it's more not out of religion, but it's out of trying to keep the peace, trying to attack anything that's different than me, because when things are unsettled, that's what happens. As a remarkable historian of Islam, Marshall Hodgkins, pointed out, from very early times, Muslim authorities often went to great lengths to humiliate and punish dhimmis, those Jews and Christians who refused to convert to Islam. It was official policy that the dhimmis should feel inferior and know their place, imposing laws such that Christians and Jews could not ride horses, but only mules, and that should even wear certain marks of their religion on their clothing and costumes when among the Muslims. In some places, non-Muslims were prohibited from wearing clothing similar to those of Muslims, nor could they have any arms, referring to weapons. In addition, non-Muslims were taxed very severely compared with the Muslims. Now, the fact that Christians imposed equally disgraceful humiliation upon Jews is beside the point, which is that the claim about Islam being this great tolerant society is just absurd fiction, fake news. And historians have managed to get away with such spurious nonsense, not only by carefully ignoring this condition that dhimmis, those who are non-Muslims, suffered, but also by twisting the fact that in both Christian and Muslim areas, there was a long tranquil period in relation to the Jews, and by choosing to compare the tranquil area of Islam with the violent time of Christianity, it's apples and bananas. You compare, this was in the 9th, 10th century. Well, remember, things were pretty stable in Spain at that time. That's why there was discrimination, but there was this outbreak. But as soon as the pressure came when the Visigothic Christians, the original Spaniards, reattacked and reunified Spain, then everything got all twisted up. When there's conflict, wherever it is in the world, it starts to make everybody that's not the majority look suspicious, and people attack. But just as Christian intolerance was greatly heightened by the conflicts with Islam involving the Crusades, so too did these conflicts result in similar outbursts that I just mentioned in Islam. In Granada alone, thousands of Jews were massacred in the late 11th century, a fact that goes unmentioned in the many historical accounts of this glorious time of Granada. thousands of Jews were murdered. In similar fashion, Western biographers of Muhammad are reluctant to acknowledge, or they quickly justify, that the first Muslim massacre of Jews, where did it occur? In Medina. When Muhammad, when he took over with power, he gathered all the local Jewish males, there was about 700 of them, he had them dig a grave, and then he had them beheaded and toppled into the grave. When all is said and done, the most compelling question about the church and anti-Semitism may not be why some Christians sometimes attack the Jews, but here's the bigger question. Why did they tolerate them at all? They were the majority. They could have just pushed them all out. Why did they tolerate them? See, unlike Christian heretics such as the Cathars or the Waldensians or the Fraticellis and other groups like that, the Jews were the only sizable, openly nonconformist religious group that survived in Europe until the Lutherans in the Protestant Reformation came into the existence through force of arms. As Robert Chazan observed, despite being the objects of suspicion and enduring many forms of discrimination, here it is, the essential fact remained that Jews were to be permitted to exist within Christian society and to fulfill their religious obligations as Jews. Why? Christians made the exception for Jews because of the theological doctrine of the second coming of Jesus Christ that would be ushered in at what moment? At the time of the conversion of the Jews, which was interpreted to mean that this Jewish nonconformity, this exclusivity, that yes, some people did some really bad things, but this fact is, this Jewish nonconformity was part of God's plan, and that their eventual conversion was in God's hands as well, and that's why we let it be. Consequently, no pope in the Middle Ages ever took a campaign to convert the Jews. And St. Augustine, this was in the 4th century, 354 to 430, he taught that anyone who killed a Jew would suffer God's sevenfold vengeance. And as for all those who would dismiss these as mere words, it seems appropriate here to quote at length the highly respected historian Stephen Katz, director of the Elie Wiesel Center for Judaic Studies at Boston University. Identifying "thou shalt not annihilate the Jews" as the 11th Christian commandment. Here's what Katz wrote. Through Christendom possessed the power, and over the course of nearly 1,500 years, to destroy that segment of the Jewish people it dominated. It chose not to do so, because the physical extirpation of Jewry was never at any time the official policy of any church or of any Christian state. Rather than actively seeking to eliminate Judaism, the ultimate luminescent irony is that the Christian dogmatics entailed protecting Jews and Judaism from extinction. Although Christian civilizations and groups and peoples demeaned and debased Jews, the church paradoxically was committed to Jewish survival until, that is, the collective repentance of the Israel of the flesh would usher in the second coming. Fascinating, huh? The Christians protected the Jews because they saw them as part of God's plan of salvation. And that's why the official church always was protecting them. And by the way, these words you can find in the Second Vatican Council on when it speaks about, the document speaks about the Jewish people. That's the reality. Ironically, this myth has been going on and on and on. And the sad thing is that because something could be plausibly true, they presume it is true. Well, in this case, it isn't true. The facts clearly show there were some Christians, some clergy, who did some bad things, no question. But the fact of the matter is, the church always stood behind the Jewish people and protected the Jewish people officially. Remember, just like we have an official doctrine, not every Catholic lives it, huh? But officially protected the Jews and condemned any oppression of them or killing of them. And the Roman Catholic Church has had a long and honorable, stout opposition to attacks upon Jews and anti-Semitism. Amen. Let's take a little break. We're going to go now to the 12th myth. Pius XII was Hitler's Pope. You hear this all the time. Sadly, Barack Obama, our president, kind of made allusions to this. You hear Bill Clinton make allusions. A lot of the left-wing people in our nation allude to this all the time. The 20th century was marked by genocides on a monstrous scale. And the most terrible we know was the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, which killed an estimated 6 million European Jews and almost as many other victims, Christians, priests, religious, and simple people. But during this dark time, the Catholic Church was shepherded by whom? Pope Pius XII, who proved himself really to be an untiring foe of the Nazis, and he determined to save as many Jewish people as he could. At the end of the World War II, Pope Pius XII was acclaimed as an extraordinary hero because of his courageous efforts to save the Jews and to fight against Hitler. Yet today, Pope Pius XII gets almost no credit for his actions before or during the war. In fact, he is now accused, as I just said, to be Hitler's Pope. How did the history get so totally revised? That's what we're going to uncover in a few minutes now. Much of the historical revision, it's the result of flat-out anti-Catholicism, both outside the church and inside the church. And on the notes, I quote a few people. Anti-Catholic author David Hunt writes, "The Vatican had no excuse for its Nazi partnership or for its continued accommodation of Hitler on the one hand, and its thunderous silence regarding the Jewish question on the other hand. The popes continued in the alliance with Hitler until the end of the war, reaping hundreds of millions of dollars in payments from Nazi Germany to the Vatican." Jack Chick, I don't know if you know who Jack Chick is. Chick publication, you ever seen them? It's when you go outside in your mall and you find all these little pamphlets on your windshield. They're made by Chick Publications, very anti-Catholic group. In his little pamphlet called Smokescreen, when World War II ended, the Vatican had egg all over its face. Pope Pius XII, after building the Nazi war machine, saw Hitler losing his battle against Russia, and he immediately jumped to the other side when he saw the handwriting on the wall. Pope Pius XII should have stood before the judges in Nuremberg. His war crimes are worthy of death. Now, an average person would say, these people are wildly crazy. They're out of touch with reality. Sadly, these kinds of statements didn't, because much of the secular world that we still encounter today is very anti-Catholic, anti-Christian, now even anti-religion. And they're so willing to take these words at face value. But the fact of the matter is the revision of history began much earlier than this recent last 30 or 40 years. It seems to be forgotten by most people that the campaign to link Pope Pius XII to Hitler, it was initiated by whom? It was initiated by the Soviet Union, presumably in hopes of neutralizing the Vatican and its efforts in post-war resettlement and rebuilding. They wanted to keep him out because the Pope was so powerful. Early in 1944, Izvestia, the official party newspaper in Moscow, claimed that Pope Pius XII had supported the Nazi regime. Well, the next day in the New York Times, now it wouldn't happen today, but that in the year 1944, the New York Times condemned that article as malicious propaganda and vigorously asserted the Pope's opposition to all forms of tyranny. But did that stop the Russians? They went on, and soon one of their agents produced a book claiming that the Vatican had signed a secret pact with Hitler. Now, it was an obvious fake, and it was only embraced by hardcore left red party liners and professional anti-Catholics, which there was a lot of them in the post-war period. Fortunately, this Soviet disinformation campaign was drowned out by choruses of praise from both secular people and especially Jewish people. As noted, Hitler had bitterly attacked the Catholic Church. As they noted, Hitler had brutally attacked the Catholic Church. He closed all Catholic schools, had arrested thousands of priests and nuns and sent them to Dachau and other death camps. As the world learned of the horrors of the Nazi death camps, Pope Pius XII was widely praised for his vigorous and devoted efforts to saving the Jewish lives during the war. 1943, Chaim Weizmann, who soon became the first president of Israel, wrote, "The Holy See is lending its powerful help wherever it can to mitigate the fate of many persecuted persecuted co-religionists. Moshe Sharett, who would be the second prime minister and Israel's first foreign minister, he met with the Pope during the final days of the war. I told him that it was my first duty to thank him, and through him to thank the entire Catholic Church on behalf of the Jewish public for all that they had done in various countries to rescue Jews. Upon Pope Pius XII's death in 1958, Golda Meir, future Prime Minister of Israel, noted Pius's efforts on behalf of the Jews, calling him what? A great servant of peace. For it was well known among generations of Jews that Pius XII had made so many personal efforts and sacrifices to protect and shelter Jews from the Nazis. But then what happened? The anti-Catholic revisionism started again. And it first started the second wave of it, or a third wave of it, with the play called The Deputy. It was written by a very left-wing German red communist who was a very secular, at one time a Christian, but he abandoned that. His name was Rolf Hochhuth. And in it, he portrayed Pius XII as an anti-Semite, a Semite who was totally indifferent to the Holocaust. Well, this play, it was about a 6-hour play, by the way. It opened to great acclaim in Berlin in 1963, and then later appeared in London the following year, and then it had its Broadway debut in 1964. Eventually, this play was translated into 20 different languages. In 2002, if you remember this movie, it was made into a movie called Amen, and it had a London revival in 2006. The theatrical reviewers for major daily papers, both in England and in Great Britain, in the United States, they hailed the play. Now, I don't care. I could never sit through a 6-hour play. You know, a lot of these people are totally out of touch with reality. But I think Susan Sontag led the way for all these New York intellectuals and for the secular progressives. The Deputy also stresses, and this is the controversial part of the play, a strong case for the complicity of the German Catholic Church and of Pius XII. This case, I'm convinced, is true and well taken, and the importance is historical and moral. In the wake of this play, many reputable, qualified historians absolutely condemned the play and shredded it. Writing from Cambridge, the historian Eamon Duffy, he said, after examining all the pertinent documents, decisively established the falsehood of Hochhuth's specific allegations. Other prominent Jews also agreed. Joseph Lichten of the Anti-Defamation League, he published a withering refutation of the Deputy and a condemnation of all its admirers. So did the Israeli diplomat Pinchas Lapidi, who testified that Pope Pius XII was instrumental in saving at least 700,000, but probably as many as 860,000 Jews from certain death at Nazi hands. These claims and others reporting the Pope's efforts to save the Jews, they were confirmed over and over again by people who did their homework, who were in the know. That's the fact. At this point then, after that play came out, everything kind of died down for a little bit, because it was so roundly condemned by very informed intellectual historians and whatnot and Jewish people. But again, what happens? A few years, it all starts open again with another spat of new books. Now, when you go and read these books, and you can get them in the notes and read them if you wish, they display remarkable ignorance as well as incredible self-indulgence. And they mostly received a positive review, again, from who? The progressive left secularists. Oh, they cheered this stuff. Because why? Because most of them are anti-Catholic, and a lot of them are, by the way, people who are in even our church. Okay? As so often happens, many qualified historians have written scathing reviews that reveal the extreme bias and the scholarly incompetence of all these authors, but sadly, the author in his book gets all the publicity. The actual critique and authentication of the falsehood of these things, it's just kind of put on page 15 of the LA Times or downplayed. It's because he was begged to do so by both Catholic and Jewish leaders in the countries under Hitler's control probably the best known of these books was John Cornwell's Hitler's Pope, The Secret History of Pius XII. It was produced in 1999. Highly biased book, starting with the title, which is a shameless bit of name-calling. The primary thesis was that Pope Pius XII negotiated a deal to help the Nazis take over Germany, thus condemning all the European Jews to death camps. And in keeping with that thesis, if you look literally on the cover, and you can just Google it up if you wish, on the book cover, the dust jacket, it seems to show soon-to-be Pope Pius XII visiting Nazi headquarters. That's the implication of John Cornwell, right on the dust cover. The fact is, that picture actually shows Pius XII leaving a reception that the president of the Weimar Republic invited him to in 1927. Pope Pius XII never met Hitler and left Germany in 1929, well before Hitler and the Nazis came to power. And the rest of the book is just as bad. It's filled with all kinds of distortions and falsehoods. But sadly, this book sold very well. It went up to 14th on the New York Times bestseller list. It got such favorable coverage on TV for 60 Minutes. And the fact that this author is a dropout from the Catholic seminary has been taken as evidence that he's not motivated by anti-Catholicism. He's totally impartial. But that ignores the fact that Cornwell himself said that he is a lapsed Catholic. And it also ignores subsequent evidence that Cornwell's claims to having examined all the secret incriminating documents in the Vatican Library were a total false claim. Absolutely false. Never went there, never did. Many distortions, falsehoods have been pointed out. The fact of the matter is, since its publication, so many scholars have leapt to Pius XII's defense that Cornwell actually had to back off his claims. And beginning in 2004, he progressively reduced the force of his charges, stating that it was impossible to know the Pope's real reasons for silence about the plight of the Jews under Adolf Hitler. But he went on still publicly to condemn him for being silent. We're going to talk about why that silence was existing. A second book that spews out a false narrative is James Carroll, Constantine's Sword, The Church and the Jews, A History. It was published in 2004. James Carroll, who is he? He was a novelist, and he's also an ex-priest. And both identities have shaped this book, and it makes unbelievably outrageous claims. It says that the Christ story itself is the basis for unrelenting Christian anti-Semitism. You get the picture, huh? If that's your leading premise of the book, you're going to have a real slanted view of things. As he put it, Auschwitz is the climax of the story that begins at Golgotha. Auschwitz, when seen in the links of causality, reveals that the hatred of Jews has been no incidental anomaly, but a central action of Christian history, because the hatred of Jews has been made holy and it became lethal. Now, he just goes on and on in this book for hundreds of pages, literally about 495 pages, explaining every kind of ache and pain he had, that his mother made him go to the seminary, and kind of forced him to be a priest, and his likes, that he likes Bob Dylan. He doesn't even get to the story of Pius after almost 500 pages, huh? His book sold very well again, and it received real positive reviews from the secularists, and particularly other people like Gary Wills and Karen Armstrong, and both of them are very left-wing Catholics, huh? Or claim to be Catholics. But again, this book was roundly condemned and disdained by real scholars. The celebrated Protestant historian Robert Louis Wilkin noted, although Carroll's subtitle claims his book is a work of history, it's nothing of the sort, being driven by theological animus and based wholly upon the works of other people. You're going to see this pattern go over and over again. Most of these people are disaffected Catholics who have an agenda to undermine the credibility of the church. That's why other books by Daniel Jonah Goldhagen, Hitler's Willing Executioners, Ordinary Germans in the Holocaust, Michael Fair, The Catholic Church in the Holocaust, John Roth, Pope Pius XII and the Holocaust, David Kurtzer, The Pope and the Mussolini, The Secret History of Pius XII and the rise of fascism in Europe, or excuse me, Pius XI. What are they? They're just angry rehashes of the same material in unscholarly ways. They just keep mimicking each other. It's like if you read a lot of anti-Catholic groups, you could trace all their claims right back to a famous anti-Catholic volume called Roman Catholicism by Lorraine Bettner. It's the encyclopedia of all anti-Catholic charges. And I've seen things in Christian churches. Someone asked me recently about Cornerstone here. He said, what do you think to my Catholic brothers and sisters? A whole list of these things here. I said, go to Lorraine Bettner and you'll see them listed right there in the index. It's all taken word for word. No scholars, no research, no footnotes, no bibliography. They just make claims. And finally, there's a book, Under His Very Windows, The Vatican and the Holocaust in Italy, written by Susan Zuccati. She was an Italian gal. The author admits that when the Nazis attempted to round up and transport Jews out of Italy, at least 85% of them survived. And most of them, why? Because they were hidden in convents, monastery, churches, and other Roman Catholic buildings in the Vatican. And they stayed there until the Allies finally came. Now, according to Zuccati, this was done without any encouragement from Pius XII, who remained above the plight. This has been an ongoing statement, despite hundreds and hundreds of testimony, written, filmed. People say, I did this because Pius XII sent the money secretly through the Vatican pouch, and he told me, do this work, save these Jews. No matter what you do, once you get a person who's got these rose-colored lenses on, they filter it all through the thing. Oh, no, maybe it was done, but he had nothing to do with it. She advanced the view against the testimony of scores of clergy, monks, and nuns, and that their actions were prompted by the Pope. That's what these testimonies were, but she just discounted them. She dismissed them as simply attempting to place the Pope in a favorable light. She dismissed even the testimony of wonderful Jewish people who spoke in Pius XII's behalf. Oh, they're just benevolently ignorant. I just find that so demeaning, benevolently ignorant. And she chose to ignore many, many facts, such as the Pope himself used a summer palace called the Castel Gandolfo to shelter thousands of Jews during the war, providing them with kosher food, literally turning his private apartment into an obstetrical ward, OBGYN. By the way, I once was given the privilege. It's opened up now, I think, to tours, but back in 1988, I knew a Jesuit priest who was in charge of the Castel Gandolfo Vatican Observatory, and he took me all through this beautiful castle, showed me places where they hid the Jews, and they took me to the Vatican, to the gardens, the walled-off gardens, excuse me, and showed me where they had literally kept thousands of Jews in these places for many, many years. All these books are part of an effort, as I said, by alienated Catholics to push the church in liberal directions. Rabbi David Dolan, he wrote a book on Pius XII I recommend you read. He said it so well. The Holocaust is simply the biggest club available for liberal Catholics to use against traditional Catholics in their attempt to bash the papacy and thereby to smash traditional Catholic teaching. These polemics of lapsed or angry liberal Catholics exploit the tragedy of the Jewish people during the Holocaust to foster their own political agenda. Someone has water, I will take a little bit. If you remember last week, I talked about this reality. I call it, in my own words, I've been fighting bronchitis this last week, so thank you. I call it Rorschach theologizing or Rorschach historicizing. What's a Rorschach test? It's an ink blot test. The psychologist hopes it, or the counselor holds it up to you. See ink blots, all these colors. Thanks, Chris. All these colors, and you sit there and you say, what do you see in those blots? You know, if you see, all you see is butterflies and rainbows and balloons, and you keep seeing it card after card, the guy's going to say, you live in a fantasy world. You know? Well, the same thing happens with these alienated Catholics. They will look at the body of history and cherry pick the things that fit their agenda and promote it as actual truth, when it's only a distorted version. It's their own particular bias. And this has been going on, and that's what these people do. They've been slowly trying to undermine the church on everything from the teaching on the church, on sexuality, all these things. These are the ones that have promoted this anti-Semitism. They're trying to foment division from within. Where's the whole truth? Or what's the whole truth about Pius XII? Well, the whole truth is that Eugenio Pachelli, that was his given baptismal name, he spoke out constantly against Hitler and racism and Nazism, or racism during the 1930s, even before he became Pius XII. He was the chosen successor from Pius XI. Pius XI wanted him because he knew that Pius XII was so brilliant, such a great diplomat, so knowledgeable, so exact about things. The former Israeli diplomat and now Orthodox Jewish rabbi, Pinchas Lapide, states that Pius XI had good reason to make Pachelli the architect of the anti-Nazi policy. Of the 44 speeches, now 44, mind you, when people say he never said anything about Nazism, 44 speeches which Nuncio Pachelli had made on German soil between 1917 and 1929, at least 40 contained attacks on Nazism or condemnations of Hitler's doctrines. Pachelli, who never met the Fuhrer, called it neo-paganism. In March 1935, Pachelli sent an open letter to the Bishop of Cologne in which he called the Nazis false prophets with the pride of Lucifer. In 1937, during a sermon at Notre Dame in Paris, he identified Germany as that noble and powerful nation whom bad shepherds would lead astray in an ideology of race. By the way, that's being said by the Jewish people, okay, and other people, even the LA Times. This was confirmed by a lot of media. Consider the headlines in the New York Times. October 28, 1939, Pope condemns dictators, treaty violators, and racism. October 6, 1942, Pope is said to plead for Jews listed for removal from France. August 27, 1942, Vichy seizes Jews Pope Pius ignored. December 26, 1941, the New York Times editorialized, "The voice of Pius XII is a lonely voice in the silence and darkness enveloping Europe this Christmas. In calling for a real new order based on liberty, justice, and love, the Pope sets himself squarely against Hitlerism." If you need more evidence, how many, if you can go and see these recorded in these different books that I wrote in the bibliography, how many Jews spoke out to thank Pius for his vigorous efforts to avoid the Holocaust and to protect Jews from the Holocaust? Rabbi Lapide records, "In Rome, we saw a list of 155 convents and monasteries, Italian, French, Spanish, English, American, and also German, mostly extraterritorial property of the Vatican, which sheltered throughout the German occupation of Rome and Italy some 5,000 Jews. No less than 3,000 Jews found refuge at one time at the Pope's summer residence in Castel Gandolfo. 60 more lived for 9 months at the Jesuit Gregorian University, and a half a dozen slept in the cellar of the Pontifical Biblical Institute." Notice in particular that Pius was not merely allowing Jews to be hidden in different church buildings around Rome, he himself was hiding them in the Vatican and in his own summer palace. If you ever see the movie The Scarlet and the Black, everybody seen that movie? About the Irish priest who was directed by Pius and how he saved all these Jews, and the Nazi commandant of Rome tried to capture him. He was so tricky. And at the end, what happens? The commandant eventually is arrested, put in prison, but who goes to visit him every week? This Irish priest. And he eventually brings conversion to this guy, and he asked to be baptized, and he was saved before he died in prison. And by the way, he got the commandant's wife and family out of Italy so they wouldn't be punished and killed by the Allies and the reaction. But that was all at the instigation of Pius XII. His success in protecting Italian Jews against the Nazis was remarkable. Lichten records that after the war was over, it was determined that only 8,000 Jews were taken from Italy by the Nazis, far, far less than all the other European countries. And by the way, this didn't go unrecognized by, again, Jewish people. Jewish authorities like the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, Isaac Herzog, sent a Pope a personal message of thanks on February 28, 1944, and he said, The people of Israel will never forget what His holiness and His illustrious delegates, inspired by the eternal principles of religion, which form the very foundation of true civilization, are doing for us, fortunate brothers and sisters, in the most tragic hour of history, which is living proof of divine providence in this world. Probably the most telling thing is that the chief rabbi of Rome, his name was Israel Zoli, he wrote this: "What the Vatican did will be indelibly and eternally engraved in our hearts. Priests and even high prelates did things that will forever be an honor to Catholicism." And in response to that, this rabbi, he said for theological reasons, but I'm sure it was set up out of gratitude to his heart, he was baptized. And what name did he take? Eugenio, after Pope Pius XII, baptismal name. And it's a famous event. These are the people that knew him. Now, that's all on the side of the Allies and whatnot. How about the other side? What were the Nazis' real perception of Pius XII? Was he really in cahoots with them? Well, it goes unmentioned in the new attacks on the Pope, but Hitler was so angered at Pius XII that in 1942, the German Ministry of Propaganda put out 10 million copies of a pamphlet identifying Pius XII as the pro-Jewish Pope. The next year, in 1943, Hitler tried to have the Pope kidnapped. Finally, in a radio message from Nazi headquarters in Rome to Berlin, sent 10 days after the attempted roundup of the Italian Jews, and it was intercepted by the Allies on October 26, 1943, Vatican has apparently for a long time been assisting many Jews. What was the final nail in the coffin of this myth? Well, I would suggest everybody get this book. I just find it a fascinating book. It's a book called Church of Spies by Mark Riebling. I listed it in the bibliography. I say it is the nail in the coffin because what did this guy do? First of all, he's an expert on top secret intelligence. He's best known for his book called The Secret War Between the FBI and the CIA, produced in 1994. His Church of Spies was produced just last year. He went to the Nazi archives, into the Christian Vatican archives, and he got all the documents. You know, for the longest time, scholars couldn't get into the Vatican archives. They were called secreto, they were separated. Now the Vatican has opened up to a lot. But you know, when people couldn't get in, other people say, well, they don't want you in because they want to hide a lot of things. The fact of the matter is they just hadn't cataloged a lot of things because there's 2,000 years of history there. I've been into those archives. There's 91 miles of shelf space under the streets of Rome with all these documents. And they're just now categorizing and putting them in order. He went in there and he examined them. And then he wrote this book, and it reads like literally a spy novel. That's why you're just captivated. The only problem I find with it is that these German names are so long, I get confused with them all. And I have to keep going back. Now, who was that guy? Who was that? So you have to keep going back. But that's the only comment I have to make, and it's only my inability to remember what the German characters were. But what he does is he explains what was going on. See, the reason he's so successful at laying to rest the myth is Mark Riebling doesn't spend a lot of time endlessly speculating all the Pope's official statements. Because if you're already prejudiced against it, you're going to find something you're not going to believe about it. If you're on this side, you're going to believe everything he says. And he doesn't spend a lot of time wondering why Pius said this or didn't say that. He went to the original sources, and he painstakingly puts together this incredible story, truth, that the Pope played the leading role in a network of Catholic spies which aimed for one purpose, to assassinate Hitler and place the German government in the hands of political and military leaders who would restore Germany to a decent nation. Why? Because every time the church spoke vociferously, like it happened in Holland or Netherlands, and when it happened, what was it? It escalated the violence against the Jews, and it destroyed the underground system by which the church was getting these people baptismal certificates and getting them out of the country. Sister Edith Stein, the great saint, blessed now Edith Stein, she was caught up in that. She was Sister Benedicta of the Cross. She'd gone to Holland to get out of Germany. Her sister sent her over there so she wouldn't be persecuted. She was a former Jew and considered by the Nazis a Jew. But because the Holland bishops spoke out vociferously, boom, everything just crushed down. And so all the religious leaders and all the people that were trying to save the Jews said, please don't speak out. The other thing is, it was to protect the Pope's efforts to hide the Jews and other Christians, if you call attention to it now. But beyond these two excellent reasons, why was the Pope a bit more silent? Because he wanted to deflect attention from his own personal orchestration of an intelligence ring that was prepared to act in accordance with Catholic teaching on tyrannicide, to get rid of the tyrant. And he had the distinct advantage of what? Already in place were a system of incredible organization of people out there who he could funnel information down to secretly and have it come back up through priests and nuns. And when you read this book, you read about these heroic people who do the most unbelievable things to pass messages back and forth. One particular guy, you should go down in history, his name is Joseph Mueller, Joy the Ox. He was a professional flyer, so he would fly from Germany, all these secret documents to Rome, pass them on to his contact, come back and forth. Now, also, the Catholic faith was the only Christian denomination that had not only the moral authority, but the moral framework by which to declare that you could take out an evil tyrant. St. Thomas Aquinas said, if a tyrant becomes so evil that he's destroying not just his people, but others, that you have a right out of, like the just war, to protect yourself, to kill that person. And Pius XII personally organized this conspiracy that led to about 3 different attempts, and they missed every time. And some people point to the fact that that had to be almost protected by evil. Some very spiritual people think that Hitler was protected by evil because they had him in their grasp, and you've seen that movie Valkyrie, the bomb up at the Wolf Lair, properly placed, and then some general kicks it, moves it to the other side of the table, and it ends the result that everybody else is killed except for Hitler. I mean, freaky things. They put a bomb on a plane while Hitler's flying back, and it was a newfangled fuse. It's supposed to work. They flew all the way into Berlin. Nothing happened. Over and over again, this thing happened. But the Catholic faith had the theology. Protestants didn't. Protestants said, no, you have to respect the temporal authority. So says Paul in Romans. Well, we're not limited just to the word. We think about the whole picture. Why did it take so long? Because, again, with a just war, you have to have certain conditions. You have to have certain conditions. In other words, that what happens, the consequence of what happened to my action to invade, it has to be less than what's going to happen if I don't. Okay, there's a sense of proportionality. Well, that was what it took time for the church to come to grips with. Okay, before we can execute this plan, what do we have to do? We have to have people in place who won't let a vacuum come in where even more evil people will come into power, but someone can take the place of Hitler. So it was a matter of building that up, and also that we have to have ability to protect the German people, because people are so angry, the Allies, they'll come and wipe everybody out, and so we had to get a thing. So the Pope was working both with the opposition party in Germany and also with the Allies, and trying to get them on board. And then when the plot happened and it didn't happen, then it set things back. But that's why it took time. It wasn't because the Pope wasn't working constantly. And most of those people that were part of this conspiracy, most of them were caught and executed very heinously. And this is what's evil, is that Hitler had them filmed, and then he would watch the films as he ate, taking a delight. By the way, when Hitler found out through his secret spy, by the way, there was former ex-priests who were on Hitler's side, who were trailing after these people, after these priests. So you're dealing with real evil here. But they would just torture them terribly and then eventually kill them. Joseph Mueller got this close to being killed, and then miraculously, his execution was stayed, and he survived the war, and eventually he met Pope Pius XII. He never met him in person up to that point after the war. But it's a remarkable, remarkable story. But it puts to rest the fact that Pius XII was working constantly, undercover. He didn't speak always so violently, even though he could have, but he knew that would then wipe out the system. It also jeopardized all this plan he had put into place by getting all these co-conspirators. So he wanted to avoid that, so to deflect attention, he was more quiet, agonizing all the time over what was happening, because he had all these reports coming, what was happening to Jews and homosexuals and special needs people being wiped out in the death camps. It just killed him inside. That's why I think he should be canonized tomorrow, because he endured so much. But the fact of the matter is he was conclusively trying to orchestrate this killing of Hitler. Unfortunately, they didn't succeed. Diabolically, Hitler took his life by his own hand. But the fact of the matter is, our history is that we have a very noble history of protecting Jews, all through history. Oh, we've had some people mess up, but you don't judge the whole by a few. That's an illogical, fallacious argument. You don't go from a minor to a major premise. Some Catholics did some bad things. Yes, there were some discriminatory things, but far and away, the church protected the Jews and had noble history of this. And Pope Pius XII, he certainly lived up to that tradition in a very glorious way. Amen.